Ethan Merrick was the kind of man no one in Dry Creek ever feared, until the day he turned his quiet life into a killing ground, leaving his 4-year-old daughter Clara bleeding in her mother's arms, fighting to survive against all odds. Dry Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the hum of tractors and the scent of fresh soil were part of everyday life. Rows of golden cornfields stretched toward the horizon, and the main street was little more than a collection of family-owned stores, a diner, and a gas station that doubled as the town's gossip hub. People knew one another's faces, names, and routines, or at least they thought they did. In a town like Dry Creek, trust was automatic. The idea of locking your door at night felt unnecessary, almost insulting to the community spirit that everyone believed kept them safe. It was a place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen until the afternoon when everything did. Ethan Merrick had lived in Dry Creek for nearly his entire life. To most, he was a quiet man, polite but not overly warm. He kept his property neat, his vehicles clean, and his head down. He worked long hours at the local grain mill, where he rarely spoke unless he had to. Yet to those few close enough to share a dinner table with him, there were signs, small at first, that something inside him had shifted. His wife Laura noticed before anyone else. The man she'd married had been serious but gentle, devoted to their daughter Clara in a way that seemed unshakable. But over time his patience thinned, his gaze hardened, and his habits changed. Neighbors recalled seeing the lights in the Merrick house on late into the night, long after the family was thought to be asleep. In the dim glow of the kitchen window, Ethan could sometimes be seen at the settle, hunched over papers, scribbling with a kind of restless intensity. He began to keep a growing collection of firearms and ammunition, stored in a locked cabinet that no one but him had access to. While guns weren't unusual in Dry Creek, Ethan's fixation on them was. He cleaned and re-cleaned them obsessively, often in the middle of the night. There were whispers of trouble at home, though no one dared ask Laura directly. She kept her head high in public, tending to Clara with warmth and tenderness, her smile unwavering. But people noticed she went out less and less, and when she did, Ethan's truck was often parked close by, as if he were keeping watch. On a Thursday afternoon in early spring, the clouds rolled in heavy and low. Rain tapped against windows, as the town settled into its familiar rhythm. At the diner, regulars sat in their usual spots, sipping coffee and talking about crops. Children's laughter carried faintly from the elementary school playground. Nothing hinted at the terror about to unfold. At 3:17 p.m., the first 911 call came in. A neighbor reported hearing sharp, deafening cracks, gunshots echoing down Willow Bend Road. Within seconds, more calls flooded the dispatch center. Voices were frantic, some barely coherent, describing figures moving through houses, bodies on the ground, and the sound of breaking glass. By the time officers were dispatched, Ethan Merrick had already made his way into multiple homes. His movements were deliberate, his targets specific. Victims included a retired couple who had once been his landlords, a former co-worker who had reported him for a safety violation, and a family who had been close friends with Laura years before. Each was struck down with precision, as though he had planned every step. The scene was unlike anything Dry Creek had ever witnessed. The street was littered with signs of chaos. Doors left hanging open, windows shattered. The smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. In the span of minutes, the town's illusion of safety was obliterated. When officers approached the Merrick home, dread settled over them. Given what they had already seen, they feared the worst. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly with the wind. Inside, the air was unnervingly still. The living room bore no signs of struggle, but a shotgun rested on the couch, its barrel still warm. In the kitchen, a coffee mug sat half-finished on the counter, as if someone had stepped away mid-sip. It was in the bedroom that they found Laura. She lay on the floor, her body curled protectively around Clara. Blood pooled beneath them, staining the carpet. Laura was gone, but Clara's chest rose and fell in faint, shallow breaths. Her tiny hands clutched the fabric of her mother's shirt as if refusing to let go. The sight stunned even the most seasoned officers. Somehow, against all odds, the child was alive. Ethan was nowhere to be found. The back door stood wide open, leading into the yard and toward the endless stretch of cornfields. A storm was building overhead, and with it a sense that the nightmare was only beginning. By the time the first patrol car reached Willow Bend Road, The scene was already spiraling beyond control. Rain slicked the pavement, pooling in shallow dips along the roadside, reflecting the flicker of red and yellow lights from approaching emergency vehicles. Officers stepped out into a silence that was heavy and unnatural, broken only by the low moan of wind pushing through the trees. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, a biting reminder of the violence that had just torn through the heart of Dry Creek. The first house they entered belonged to Gerald and Marlene Rhodes, an elderly couple who had lived in the town for over 50 years. The front door had been kicked in with such force that the wood splintered from its hinges. Inside, furniture lay overturned, glass crunched underfoot, and framed photographs hung crooked or lay shattered on the floor. Both victims were found in the living room, still in their chairs, as though they had no time to react before the shots were fired. It was a deliberate execution, not a chaotic spray of bullets. Whoever was responsible had been calm, controlled, and precise. Further down the road, the second crime scene revealed the same brutal efficiency. This time, it was the home of Alan Pierce, a former co-worker of Ethan's, who had once filed a complaint against him, unsafe handling of machinery at the mill. Alan's body was found near the back door, as though he had tried to escape but hadn't made it in time. The pattern was becoming clear. These weren't random killings. Each victim had some personal connection to Ethan, a reason, real or imagined, for being on his list. Officers moved quickly, trying to get ahead of the killer's path, but the timeline was working against them. By the time they reached the third house, they were already too late. A young mother and her teenage son lay in the entryway, groceries spilled across the floor, a bag of apples rolling in a slow arc from where it had been dropped. This family had been close friends with Laura years ago, until a falling out no one in town seemed to fully understand. Now whatever had caused the rift seemed to have been paid back in blood. Word of the shooting spread faster than the rain clouds overhead. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time in years, peering through curtains at the flashing lights, and armed officers moving from house to house. Dads rushed to pull their children inside, unsure if the killer might strike again at random. But the police weren't dealing with a man acting without thought. This was targeted, calculated. What made it worse was that Ethan's own home had yet to be checked. Officers approached cautiously, their weapons drawn, unsure whether they were walking into a hostage situation or a scene even more grim. The Marek property was eerily still. The front yard was undisturbed, the curtains drawn. The only movement came from the slow sway of the front door, pushed open by the wind. Inside, the living room appeared untouched, a jarring contrast to the chaos outside. A shotgun rested across the couch cushions, its metal still radiating warmth from recent use. A pair of boots sat neatly by the wall, their soles caked with fresh mud. In the kitchen, a cup of coffee cooled on the counter, a faint curl of steam still rising from its surface. It was as if the house had been frozen in the middle of an ordinary day, except for the quiet, almost imperceptible sound of shallow breathing coming from the back. In the bedroom, the sight was harrowing. Laura's body lay twisted, one arm draped protectively over Clara, who was barely conscious. The child's skin was pale, her lips tinged with blue. A dark stain spread across her small shirt where the bullet had grazed her chest, missing her heart by a matter of millimeters. Paramedics rushed forward, lifting her carefully from her mother's arms. They worked frantically, wrapping her in blankets, checking her vitals, and applying pressure to the wound. Laura could not be saved. The expression on her face, even in death, was one of fierce determination, as though her final act had been to shield her daughter from the worst of the violence. That act had worked. Clara was alive. Weak, but alive. Ethan, however, was gone. The back door was wide open, leading into the sprawling fields beyond. Officers traced muddy footprints that disappeared just a few yards into the corn, swallowed by the rain and the thick stalks. The killer could be anywhere. He could be watching them even now. As the storm broke overhead, the manhunt began. Patrol cars spread out along dirt roads. Helicopters thudded low through the sky, and search teams moved shoulder to shoulder through the fields. But the landscape was working in Ethan's favor. Every row of corn, every empty barn, every abandoned shed became a possible hiding place. He had vanished into the countryside as if swallowed whole. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize Clara. The bullet had missed every vital organ. Though blood loss was a serious threat, nurses moved quickly, their faces tense, knowing the child's survival would be nothing short of a miracle. Outside her room, officers waited for any sign that she might regain consciousness. She was the only living witness to what had happened inside that house, and perhaps the only person who could answer the question no one yet understood: why her father had left her alive. The search for Ethan Merrick stretched into the night. The small town transformed into a landscape of fear and suspicion. Floodlights swept across the wet fields, their beams cutting through the heavy mist rising from the ground. Every creak of an old barn door, every rustle in the cornstalks, sent search teams on high alert. The rain that had started earlier in the day was now a steady drizzle, blurring the edges of flashlights and making footprints vanish within minutes. Officers knew they were chasing a man who understood the land better than anyone. Every dirt road, every animal trail, every place where someone could disappear without a trace. In the early hours, a team discovered a faint trail near a shallow creek on the edge of town. The mud showed fresh impressions from boots, matching the size and tread of those found in Ethan's home. For a brief moment, it felt like they were closing in, but the prints led to a narrow crossing where rocks jutted out from the water, and then they were gone. It was as if he had stepped out of existence. The possibility that he had an accomplice began to take root. Someone in Dry Creek might have given him shelter, food, or even transportation. That thought cast a shadow over the search, as it meant the killer could be hiding just a few doors away from the victims' families. At the hospital, Clara lay in a private room under constant watch from 2 armed officers. Machines beeped softly around her, the rhythmic sound of oxygen hissing from a nasal tube, keeping time with her faint breathing. Her small chest rose and fell under a web of bandages. The bullet had missed her heart by less than a finger's width, but the trauma had been severe. Doctors spoke of her survival in careful tones, saying it was nothing short of miraculous. Though sedated, her fingers twitched occasionally, a faint sign of life that nurses found themselves watching for as if it were proof that hope still existed in the middle of so much loss. While Clara fought to recover, investigators pieced together Ethan's movements before the rampage. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed him the previous night, filling a red jerrycan and paying in cash. A clerk recalled that he had bought black gloves, a pack of cigarettes, and several bottles of water. Nothing about the interaction had seemed unusual at the time. Later, a neighbor reported hearing hammering from Ethan's garage well past midnight, though they hadn't thought to mention it until after the killings. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. An abandoned shed 5 miles from town, hidden behind a collapsed fence, caught the attention of a deputy scanning the area by spotlight. Inside, the floor was littered with discarded food wrappers, cigarette butts, and a few pages torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable, blocky, pressed hard into the paper, the same style seen in Ethan's work logs at the mill. The entries were disjointed and erratic, rambling about being watched and betrayed. He wrote of neighbors conspiring against him, of whispers in the streets, of poisoned soil and tainted water. Each passage built into an increasingly paranoid vision of the world, culminating in a chilling declaration that the events to come would be his final cleansing. The discovery painted a clearer picture of his state of mind, but it also deepened the sense of dread. This wasn't a man lashing out in a moment of rage. This was someone who believed his actions had purpose, someone who had planned every detail. The notebook didn't mention Clara at all, leaving unanswered the question haunting everyone involved. Why had he left her alive? The media swarmed Dry Creek within hours of the first broadcast, turning the quiet town into a spectacle. Reporters stood outside the police cordon, speaking into cameras as if narrating a war zone. Satellite trucks lined the main street, their dish antennas pointed skyward. Headlines dubbed Ethan the mass killer dad. Each word meant a shot to burn itself into the memory of viewers. For residents, the presence of so many strangers with cameras only heightened their unease. The police chief held a press conference, promising that Ethan's capture was a matter of when, not if. But behind the confident words, officers knew the truth. Every hour that passed without a lead gave him more time to disappear. The county brought in tracking dogs and even consulted with state police for aerial thermal imaging, but rain and cold ground temperatures worked against them. Night after night, the search expanded, spilling into neighboring counties. Yet every fresh lead dissolved into nothing. A sighting that turned out to be a farmer in the fields. A shadow caught on a trail camera that was just a deer. The sense of frustration and exhaustion grew. Still, the image of Clara in her hospital bed fueled their determination. The smallest victim of the massacre had somehow clung to life, and that alone made stopping Ethan more than just a duty. It became a matter of justice. The break in the case came almost by accident. After days of fruitless searching, an anonymous tip reached the sheriff's office just before midnight. The caller, their voice low and urgent, claimed to have seen a man moving near the old grain silo on the outskirts of town. The property had been abandoned for years, its rusting metal walls and sagging roof a silent reminder of better harvests long past. It wasn't a place most people dared to approach after dark. Officers moved quickly, forming a perimeter and cutting their lights as they drew near. The night was cold, the air damp from another evening of light rain. From a distance, the silo loomed like a black tower against the cloudy sky. Faint light leaked from a small crack in one of its warped panels. Moving silently, officers advanced, their boots sinking into the wet earth. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The plan was to catch the suspect before he could vanish again into the maze of fields and back roads. Peering through a gap in the siding, one officer caught sight of a figure crouched on the dirt floor inside. The man was digging, a small shovel in his hands, sweat glistening on his vest despite the chill. Beside him lay an open duffel bag stuffed with ammunition, bottles of water and thick rolls of cash. The scene confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. Ethan had been preparing for a long disappearance, possibly even another strike. On the sheriff's signal, the team moved in. The metal door screeched as it was shoved open, the sudden noise startling a cluster of birds roosting in the rafters. They erupted in a flurry of wings, their cries echoing in the cavernous space. Ethan froze, his eyes locking on the figures entering with weapons raised. There was no shout, no plea, no sign of panic. He simply lowered the shovel and stepped back. Officers ordered him to the ground. He complied without resistance, his face expressionless, his gaze unfocused, as though his mind had drifted somewhere far away. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, and the search of his pockets turned up a small notebook similar to the one found in the shed. Its final pages were filled with short, jagged phrases. "They will see. It's almost finished, and only the chosen remain." None of it made immediate sense, but it added another layer to the disturbed thinking that had driven his actions. With Ethan secured, the weight of the moment began to sink in. The manhunt that had drained the town's resources and kept residents in a state of constant fear was finally over. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge of what had already been lost. The bodies of friends, neighbors and loved ones had been buried in the days since the rampage, each funeral reminding the community of the deep wounds left behind. The trip back to the sheriff's office was silent. Ethan sat in the back of the patrol car, his reflection barely visible in the rain-streaked glass. He didn't flinch at the flashes of cameras as they pulled into the Sally Port, the press having swarmed the station the moment word of his capture spread. Interrogators spent hours trying to draw information from him, but he offered nothing. Not a word about the killings, not an acknowledgement of his daughter's survival. He seemed impervious to questions, staring at the wall as though the people in the room were no more than background noise. Every attempt to provoke a reaction failed. It was as if the man who had terrorized Dry Creek had already retreated into a place no one could reach. When the trial came, it was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched his weapons, witness statements placed him at the scenes, and his own writings painted the picture of a deliberate, premeditated massacre. Survivors sat in the courtroom, their faces set with quiet determination as they listened to the charges read aloud. Clara, too young to understand the proceedings, sat in the care of relatives near the back. Her presence was a living reminder of the one life Ethan hadn't taken, though whether that was mercy or cruelty remained a question without an answer. The jury found him guilty on all counts. The sentence was multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Ethan remained motionless, neither defiant nor remorseful. In the eyes of many, that absence of reaction was more chilling than any outburst could have been. By the time the prison transport van pulled away, Dry Creek was left with the quiet aftershock of a tragedy that would never truly fade. The man who had once been part of their everyday landscape was gone, but the scars he left, both physical and invisible, would mark the town forever. In the years that followed, Dry Creek slowly rebuilt itself, though the shadow of the massacre never truly lifted. The houses on Willow Bend Road that had been crime scenes were eventually emptied. their windows boarded up and lawns left to grow wild. For a time they stood as silent monuments to what had happened, unwelcome reminders that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can take root. Eventually they were torn down, leaving behind only empty lots. Grass grew where blood had once been spilled, but the land never felt the same. Clara Marek's survival became the thread of hope that many clung to in the aftermath. In the early months, her recovery was slow and uncertain. The wound to her chest had healed physically, leaving a pale, thin scar, but the trauma was something no surgery could erase. She spent long stretches in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, surrounded by nurses who learned to recognize the small signs of progress. A steadier step, a longer night's sleep, a moment of laughter that came unexpectedly. She was placed in the care of Laura's sister, who lived several towns away. The move was intentional, meant to give her distance from the place where her world had shattered. Life in her new home was whiter, safer, but marked by caution. Neighbors were kind, but they knew who she was. The story of the little girl who lived had traveled far beyond county lines, making Clara a symbol of resilience to strangers she would never meet. As she grew older, Clara learned the broad strokes of what had happened, though the finer details were left to the files locked away in police archives. The questions that couldn't be answered, why her father had done it, why she had been spared, hung in the air like unspoken truths. Some speculated it was a flicker of guilt in an otherwise dark mind. Others believed it was a calculated cruelty meant to leave her burdened for life. Clara never offered her own theory. When asked, she would simply say she didn't remember much, a statement that was only half true. Ethan Marek's presence remained a distant shadow. Imprisoned in a maximum security facility, he was kept under constant watch, his contact with the outside world limited to monitored mail and rare, approved visitors. He never requested to see Clara, nor did he send a letter in the years that followed. In interviews, prison staff described him as quiet, detached, and uncooperative, a man who seemed content to live within the walls of his own mind. To the public, he was a figure of evil whose name would always be tied to the tragedy. To Clara, he was simply a void, someone she once knew but no longer recognized. The town of Dry Creek found ways to honor those who had been lost. A memorial was built in the small park near the center of town, a semicircle of granite stones engraved with the victims' names. Every spring, on the anniversary of the Rampage, people gathered there to place flowers and light candles. It was a quiet ritual, solemn but necessary, a way to reclaim a sense of unity. Clara attended in the early years, holding her aunt's hand, though she stopped going as she entered her teens. The memories the town carried were not the same as hers, and she preferred